This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Please note that this episode contains sensitive topics which some listeners may find distressing.
Hi there. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 59. Jumping into our first question, Arav from India asks, are first and second languages wired differently in the brain or just at different locations?
Well, that's a wonderful question. And of course, it comes down to how you define similar versus different wiring. Second languages. Remarkably, I discovered about 50% of people on Earth at any given point either know a second language or are in the process of trying to learn it. So, what's going on in the brain when you are doing that? Learning a second language as a 2-year-old versus as a 90-year-old? Okay, quick primer, neurobiology of language, total false dichotomy between two areas of the brain, something called Broca's area, and that's near the motor cortex, making your muscles move. Broca's area producing language. Another, Wernicke's area, which is near the auditory cortex, comprehending language. Very, very sort of dichotomized there. And connecting the two is something called the superior longitudinal fasciculus that connects Wernicke's and Broca's. And a really good way of appreciating what they do is seeing what happens when there's damage to any of those three areas. And you get an aphasia, a disruption of language facility. But depending on which area, it varies. So let's start off. Suppose you have damage to Wernicke's. You can say, do we have any more of the vegetarian black bean chili in the fridge? And if the person answers and says, yep, it's on the top shelf far left, you're not going to understand that because you have disruption to comprehension. On the other hand, if you have damage to Broca's, comprehension is fine. The person could say to you, there's vegetarian black bean chili in the refrigerator, and you'll get up and go look for it. And for some reason, you can't find it, and you're trying to say you can't find it, but it's this non-fluent disruption. Or you can have damage neither to Wernicke's or Broca's, but to that longitudinal fasciculus that connects the two. So you could sit somebody down and they understand you talking about the weather, and they can spontaneously want to talk about the trade deficit. But if you say to them, say the words vegetarian black bean chili, they can't. They can't connect immediately, directly, the comprehension with the production. Okay, so simplified version of those two brain areas and their connections. One additional bit of language neurobiology. Primer is for like 95% of people, language is localized on the left side of the brain. And the dogma used to be the right side, the equivalent areas do nothing, who knows what, and what people learned over the years is that the right side, again, in about 90% of people, is for prosody, the meaning you give with your tone of voice. So you could say, for example, is there ever vegetarian black bean chili here? And if instead you open up the refrigerator and there's a gigantic vat of it and it's full of jalapenos and it looks so terrific, you could say, is there ever black bean vegetarian chili here in the refrigerator? I'm hungry. So we look at kids. We look at kids, and sort of the dogma is, language comprehension, language acquisition, language production is one of the most amazing things we do as a species. And kids do it in ways that make you realize how much of a propensity, how much of a proclivity the infant brain has towards absorbing language, producing it. You see kids up to around 12 months of age or so are what are termed equipotential, and that they can learn any language at all. And they can comprehend the difference between any two sounds. And what happens is by about 12 months of age, kids are getting better at comprehending the differences in the sounds of the language they're hearing. And they get less effective at hearing the difference between two sounds in some other language. And you're beginning to get a specialization of that way. Another bit of dogma, it's early in life that you're getting your accent. And if you were not fluent in some language by the time you're 12, 13, 14 years old. You're never going to have a perfect accent. Okay, so what we have is this whole notion of what is the acquisition of your initial language about and what's going on with secondary language acquisition. And a concept really dominated the field by this guy, Eric Lenenberg, who was a linguist and neurologist at Harvard, who in the 1960s took a theme from a lot of brain development with this notion of critical developmental periods. There's a critical time window in which kids learn their primary language. And if it doesn't happen during that time, some sort of window of fluency closes so that it's never quite going to be up to speed. And what his notion was that in kids who acquired a second language, who were bilingual right from the beginning, it was intermixed with the primary language and was part of that critical developmental period, and it was great. Since then, people have learned, of course, it's not that clear cut that there's a demarcated boundary, that your primary language gets taken in at that point. You see that, in fact, there is more overlap. So, what happens when you are learning a second language? Not as an infant, not while you're learning your primary one, but at any point later in life, what you see is the language production of your second language winds up being around your Broca's area, but more around it, part of the brain called the inferior temporal gyrus. And meanwhile, comprehending the second language, nicely switching arms, while you have Wernicke's area here, you have wrapped around it, the inferior parietal lobe is where the second language is coming in. Okay, so right off the bat, that tells us it's not the primary areas, but instead kind of out in the suburbs where you're getting a second language in there. So is it forever going to be more primitively coded in your brain than your primary language? And as my first response being it depends on how you are defining this. But one of the things that people have realized in more recent years with brain imaging techniques is as you learn a second language, the surrounding area that's going to take on the task of the second language, you begin to get thicker connections of neurons there, more dendrites, more axonal arbors, more axonal projections, what would be referred to as gray matter. And you get more myelin wrapping around those projections, more white matter. You've got this obscure concept in the field of the white matter, not only there being more white matter, but it being more organized. And this is basically sort of an indirect measure of efficiency, how much the myelin sheaths around your axons are running in parallel. So you see stuff is developing there, stuff is getting better in that regard. So, in that way, it's yet another example of neuroplasticity. You spend a weekend learning how to juggle, and what you see is by the end of the weekend, parts of your motor cortex have expanded, gray matter, white matter expansion, all of that very rapid. What you see with second language acquisition is it's not until months and months into intense studying of the language that you begin to see these neuroplastic changes in the area surrounding Broca's and the area surrounding Wernicke's. What you then begin to see is one of the things that prompts all of those learn a second language to save you from dementia kind of thing, which is there's reasonably good evidence that when you are inducing neuroplastic changes in these second language type areas, it's making the rest of your cortex more amenable to neuroplastic changes. It's one of the better ways of having generalized sort of increased malleability, increased plasticity. Interestingly, one of the areas that also has to get more up to speed when you get a second language is one having to do with inhibition of your motor cortex. What's that about? So that you're keeping the two languages straight, that whole thing of making sure you're answering in the correct language, and that whole phenomenon that anyone who learned French 45 years ago and were terrible at it and barely remembered any and are now trying to learn Urdu. As soon as you try to speak in Urdu, suddenly your French is the most fluent it's been in half. Your brain's got to work hard to distinguish amongst multiple secondary languages and from the first one. Okay, so that generalizes to the brain working better overall. So one could then ask sort of three final questions. Does anyone ever acquire as a second language their language so that they have the facility, they have the fluency of a native language speaker? And the dogma there used to be, no, it's never quite there. And unless you're some highfalutin linguist with some fancy tests on board, if somebody gets good enough, they're essentially indistinguishable. Next question, a quantitative one. So when you expand gray matter, white matter in the secondary areas, and among other things, the consequence of that is your cortex there gets thicker. Does it ever get as thick and as gray matterish and white matterish as the primary language areas? And that's not clear at this point. That one needs to be found out. So, final question is when you get really good at a new language, so much so that nobody can tell anymore from your accent, from your vocabulary, that you're not a native speaker and you're cortex there has changed as much as possible. Are there any qualitative differences in between how the secondary language at the point of fluency and the primary one? Are there any qualitative differences? And there appears to be one very important one, and this comes through in dementias, cortical dementias. And what you see is we've already heard there's this dichotomy between long-term memory, what month it is, what you had for breakfast today, what your occupation is, the name of your loved ones, what year did you get married, sort of thing, and remote memory, childhood memories, the smell of your grandmother's pastries, what song you learned on her knee. And one of the things the field realized is amid dementias like Alzheimer's attacking long-term memory, this very, very early life memory, now termed remote memory, is in some way archived in a stronger way. Alzheimer's blows conventional long-term memory out of the water, so you don't know what decade it is, but the early life memories are still there. They're more robust. And you see that in terms of native language and acquired language. Often as Alzheimer's progresses, someone might lose entirely their secondary language that they were utterly fluent at, but they didn't learn it until they were a young adult or whatever. Whereas what is preserved, what's more intact, is your childhood language. And that will produce circumstances where, in fact, somebody has not functioned in their childhood language for 70 years since they emigrated or something. And as the dementia spreads, their acquired secondary language goes down the tubes, and suddenly the fluency of their childhood language comes roaring back again. So, what that tells you is, yep, stored in slightly different places. Is there as much neuroplastic expansion for a secondary language as the primary? It's not clear at this point. Are there qualitative differences? Clearly, if the primary stuff is more resistant to dementia type damage, than the secondary layers.
All right, now Brad from California asks us both, can you pass the marshmallow test?
The marshmallow test. Every neurotic parent on earth has heard about the marshmallow test. And if they didn't force their child to undergo it at some point, have their own internal beliefs as to how their child would have done. The marshmallow test. The marshmallow test was first pioneered by a psychologist at Stanford named Walter Mischel in the 1960s. And thus we have this week the SME, the Stanford Marshmallow Experiment, in contrast to a few weeks ago where we had the Stanford Prison Experiment. And this one is a whole lot more palatable because, the Stanford Prison Experiment involved strip searching people and they had to pee in buckets. And in this one, all that it involved was eating marshmallows. Or, as is never indicated when people learn about it, every now and then people would use pretzels instead if kids didn't like marshmallows. So we've got the Stanford marshmallow experiment. Here's how it would be done. You sit down a kid, typically a 5-year-old, and there's a plate in front of me. You put down a marshmallow and you say, here's the deal. Look at this marshmallow. We love marshmallows. I'm going to go out of the room for a while. You can have the marshmallow if you want, but if you wait, if you show gratification postponement, if you hold on until I come back, you can have two marshmallows. And then they go out. And of course, the whole thing is seeing which kids at what ages can hold out for how long, what sort of strategies they use to sort of resist. And what winds up happening is a subset of kids are good at it and a subset are not. What's most striking, go onto YouTube, there's all these great videos of kids taking the marshmallow test where you see all the different strategies. The kid covers their eyes, or they face the other way, or they put the marshmallow below the plate, or they push it away, or they just pick it up and they listen to it, or they sniff it, or they pretend to lick it, or they pet it, or they sing to it. All these means of not eating it until the person comes back. And what this test is tapping into is, as we know from previous episodes, prefrontal cortex, long-term planning, gratification postponement. Prefrontal cortex, there's not a whole lot of it yet working in a 5-year-old, whereas some of the anticipatory dopaminergic aspects of the brain are already going full speed. So seeing the marshmallow test response is kind of an assay of how well the prefrontal cortex is doing at reining in sort of dopaminergic anticipation. And of course, what you see is not only tremendous variation in individual kids, how well they do at it, and at what ages, but cultural difference as well, of course. Now, what goes into it is, of course, trying to understand what Michelle and colleagues spent a lot of time on was trying to understand what were the more successful strategies. And one thing that came through was what is not a successful strategy, which is to sit there staring at the marshmallow and saying, it looks so great to eat one. And that's why I'm going to hold out to eat twice as many. That's never going to work. What all the successful strategies would be built around was distraction. Distraction, harping back to, in the face of temptation, is resisting temptation mostly being able to like wrestle down Satan, or is it about being able to distract yourself? And what the studies show is, as with an awful lot of gratification postponement tasks, uh, self-discipline doesn't work anywhere as well as distraction. All right, so that's what 5-year-olds look like taking the marshmallow test. But then the field got blown open by the researchers doing something interesting, which is to go back and look at those ex-5-year-olds years, decades later, and seeing did how well you did on the marshmallow test, did how well you managed to hold out for the next marshmallow for two of them. Was that predictive of anything later on in life? And it turned out what the original findings were was, whoa, did it ever? Like, if you were really good at holding out for the second marshmallow, that was a predictor of higher SAT scores in high school. That was a predictor of a healthier BMI, body mass index, in adulthood. That was a predictor of greater overall lifetime educational attainment. Whoa, this was already a predictor of the whole trajectory of the future ahead of you. And that's what the marshmallow test is mostly good for. Because most people are not caring if their 5-year-old is good at holding on for an extra 10 seconds. They're wondering if this is telling you about like what university they're going to get into down the line. So that was the real like exciting part of the outcome of the experiment. Of course, in the years since then, what the studies have shown is the effect isn't quite as strong as came through in the initial study. And what people have realized since then is a big modifying factor is socioeconomic status of the family the kid is growing up in. And some of the studies have failed to replicate it. The general theme, though, I think, looking at the field is It's a real effect. It is predictive of stuff, but it is not as predictive as people got all excited and hot and bothered about back when. So this brings us back to Brad's question, which is, how about me? How would I do in the marshmallow test? When I was 5 years old, I would have been amazing on the marshmallow test. I don't recall ever being given it, but my entire life was built around training for marshmallow test. I would have been incredible. The person would have come back and given me the second one, and I would have said, no, take it away, bring it back in 3 weeks, and let's see if I can hold out till then. Or I would have challenged the adult to see if they can hold out for as long as I did. Or I could have gone on about, of course I can hold out, because if I didn't hold out, I wouldn't get into heaven and God wouldn't approve of me. Or I'm holding off on the second marshmallow until I get admitted into the nursing home of my choice somewhere decades from now. Yes, I was very, very compliant and self-disciplined. These days, I would be so much worse on the marshmallow test than I was as a 5-year-old. And I think it's for a number of reasons. First off, because my brain is senescing. And one of the most characteristic things about brain aging, starting when you're about 40 years old, is you begin to lose prefrontal cortical neurons and function there. So gratification post moment isn't so hot by my age as in younger points in life. I would say a second reason is, the horizon of the future is getting shorter. So why screw around and wait for two marshmallows when you can have one right now? I think probably the biggest reason is I am much less anhedonic now than I was as a 5-year-old, and hanging out with the likes of you, Offspring, and the rest of the family has made me value pleasure for many more reasons. So all of that combined, I think, would make me fairly less effective at the marshmallow test now than back when I was 5.
In my case, I certainly would not pass the marshmallow test now or when I was 5. That's mostly attributable to the fact that marshmallows specifically have been my kryptonite since I had teeth. So I feel unfairly targeted by this test, and maybe the alternative pretzel method would give me a fighting chance. Okay, so switching tones, we are going to wrap up with a sensitive topic here. So, Josie from Brazil asks, is cutting addictive? Do people release enough endorphins for it to be addictive?
Cutting, cutting, one of those strange ways in which our brains can betray us and fall apart in unexpected ways. In this case, people who intentionally cut themselves. This didn't used to exist as a term in psychiatry. It's not a formal diagnosis yet. But unlike decades ago, you can encounter someone who would say, God, my first years of high school were just a nightmare. I was such a wreck. I was cutting. I became a cutter. This is now a thing. This is part of a larger category of ways in which people intentionally damage themselves, not as an act of suicide, not cutting their wrists, but are now termed non-suicidal self-injury. And cutting is the most common, burning, intentionally injuring yourself, bruising yourself, and such. How do you begin to recognize that in someone? You see unexplained scars in this adolescent, unexplained burns. They have a lot of excuses as to, oh, I tripped, I was cutting something in the kitchen and I slipped, or they begin to wear long sleeved shirts and long pants. They get socially withdrawn. You begin to see markers like that. Oh, so familiar by now, like a lot of these related to it. It is predominantly female, but not entirely so. It is predominantly adolescent onset. It is predominantly resolving somewhere early adulthood, but in some people it continues forever. What are some of the predictors of this behavior? Really, really useful when you look at the literature. One predictor is people with poor coping skills, and another is people who have difficulty handling emotions. You think the third predictor seems a lot more informative, which is a history of some sort of trauma. Now, when you look at it, there's an immediate temptation to say, aha, we're looking at another one of these psychiatric disorders of westernized lifestyle, of privileged middle class adolescents who go doing this. And what you see instead is aspects of non-suicidal self-injury are found all over the planet and all sorts of places historically, and it's usually masked in the form of religious ritualism. And harking back to anorexia mirabilis, miraculous anorexia, that you could get away with that in the 14th century of anorexia. And if you were the right type of nun, this was glorified. So you see versions of non-suicidal self-injury in cultures all over the place in a ritualistic, in a religious form, and where, as we will see, it serves some of the same purposes, some sort of purging. Some sort of purging. Okay, comorbidities with it. Who tends to have cutting as a problem, or NSSIs in general? And big surprise, it co-varies a lot with depressive disorders. It co-varies a lot with what are termed characterological disorders, personality disorders, narcissism, histrionic personalities, borderline, great, mysterious, poorly understood domains of minds turning on you. Very interestingly, in about a third of cases, it co-varies with anorexia. And as we'll see, it really does have a lot in common with that. And in terms of that, it shares one fascinating trait with anorexia, which is you go, and this is what you're studying, and you use a public health infectious disease model where you see, ooh, was the first person exposed to this virus? And then you see who they spread it to, and our whole pandemic world of all sorts of metrics of how many people on the average each carrier infects in turn. And when you look at the spread of anorexia in most typically a community of adolescent girls, when you look at the spread of cutting and related aberrant behaviors, they fit infectious disease models. Being around someone who is charismatic, who is becoming anorexic, who is cutting, that spreads amongst other kids around them. So we've got a pretty disturbing profile here. So, of course, the question becomes, what purpose is this serving? Why would anyone want to do this, to put themselves through something painful like this again and again in some cases? And one variant, one subtype that you see are people who are sort of depersonalized, who are not feeling the pain, are not going, they say they feel no pain. But far more common is you feel the pain, and that is deeply intertwined with why you're doing it. One version of it, you're feeling the pain, and that's the point because you're feeling so little of anything else. Just your life is emotionally empty, and at least I can feel pain. At least I can force that to happen amid everything else seeming lifeless. So that's one version. Another version is you want to feel the physical pain because that's a good distraction from the severe emotional pain. And that's another possible one. And you better know by now that's not going to work for long because, as we know, the part of your brain that processes physical pain and processes emotional pain, there's an overlap in those areas, this area of the anterior cingulate cortex. So they are not as different as one might think. But nonetheless, you see some individuals fall into being cutters because the physical pain at least is noisier and more right there in the moment than the constant gnawing, sort of corrosive emotional pain. Another domain in which you see this, and this has to do with people who tended to have been traumatized by something earlier on. And this is someone who's been trained. You've got so damn little control in your life about the really big things, the really scary things, and bad stuff can happen to you and you have no control over it. And this is this paradoxical realm where at least I've got some control here, where there's nothing I can do in this setting and that there's at least I can do this. At least there's something I have some agency here, some control here, a like heartbreakingly pathologic version of asserting at least you have some control. Then there's another element which has some relationship to anorexia. Anorexia very intertwined as a personality style with perfectionism, and there's some element of wanting to transcend earthly, mortal, fleshly needs. Like, I am so perfect now, I don't even need to eat anymore. This is how. And the version here is a type of transcendence that people try to get of I can master pain. I can cut myself evening after evening when everybody else is asleep, and I can do it. I am above pain. I have transcended it. I feel it, but it is just an abstraction to me. It is proof at the power that I have to transcend my corporeal self. Now, amid all those different angles, another one, again, these are not clean subsets, but intertwined with a lot of the other ones, is in a subset, in a frequent subset of people who become cutters. When you finally cut, there's a sense of euphoria. It's pleasurable. It's transiently pleasurable, but it is pleasurable, this intermixture of at least I'm feeling, which kind of feels great. At least I'm exerting some control, which kind of feels great. And this brings us back to Josie's question of, is cutting addictive? Can it be addictive? And is there anything about the underlying biology of it that makes sense with an addiction model? And the answer is absolutely yes. Addiction, opioids, you take an opioid drug and you are tapping into a neurotransmitter system in your brain, endogenous opioids, natural opioids like beta endorphin and kephalin. There's a whole family of those. And there's a literature by now suggesting there is something wrong with the opioid system in individuals who are cutters in exactly the way you would predict and in exactly the version that is going to make this an addictive cycle. You look at individuals who are cutters with non-suicidal self-injury patterns, and you look at their opioid levels, their own bodies and opioids, beta endorphin and such, in their bloodstream and their saliva, just in general. And what you see is they have suppressed levels, lower than average. And thus, opioid-like euphoric effects are lacking. There's a poverty of in people like this. And of course, now the key question, right after they have cut, right after they have harmed themselves, is there a burst of beta endorphin release? And the really distressing answer is yes. So we've now have one of those chicken and egg sort of things. Is this people who, because of a tonic chronic depletion of endogenous opioid tone, do not feel a whole lot of euphoria, somehow before all these twists and turns are done with, cutting yourself at least gives you a burst of that before you go down to the depleted level. That's one version of chicken egg. The other version is, if you get into this pathologic mindset of cutting yourself causes a boost of beta endorphins, you get depleted the rest of the time and go, in either of those scenarios, this is an addictive cycle. What's the cleanest evidence that the beta endorphin burst after cutting is really important? You take people who are chronic cutters and you give them a drug which blocks opioid receptors so that things like beta endorphin and kephalin don't work anymore, a drug called naltrexone, and cutters cut less. When you block the post-cutting euphoria, this twisted Mobius strip source of pleasure, when you block the capacity to feel that neurochemically, cutting goes down. So that suggests an addiction model, and it is a heartbreaking one, and it is a destructive one, and it is lurking underneath the long sleeves of all sorts of troubled adolescents out there. Again, something one could not imagine until you see that this is one version of trying to get some emotional sanctuary in all the wrong places.
And if anyone is struggling with this personally, we obviously urge you to reach out to your community for support, and we've also included some resources in the video description. And that is it for episode 59. Keep submitting questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight and bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Chair Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.